May it please the court, my name is Brian Kang, along with my co-counsel Angela Nguyen, and we represent the petitioner in today's case, Tyson Timms.
We will be addressing 2 points: why the excessive fines clause should be incorporated through the privileges and immunities clause, and why the fines that were imposed onto Mr. Timms were excessive fines. Would the court benefit from a brief recitation of the facts?
Yes, very brief.
On January 13th, Tyson Timms purchased the Land Rover for $42,058.30 with the money he inherited from his father's life insurance policy. When he bought the Land Rover, it had 1,237 miles on its odometer. Over the next 5 months, he drove more than 16,000 miles in the vehicle. He then regularly drove this vehicle between Marion and Richmond, Indiana to buy and transport heroin. A confidential police informant later learned of Timms' drug trafficking. The police then decided to set up a drug purchase, and on their third buy, the police apprehended Timms during a traffic stop.
In June 2013, the state charged Timms with 2 counts of dealing a controlled substance and 1 count of conspiracy to commit theft. In 2015, Timms pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony in dealing and 1 count of felony conspiracy to commit theft. The trial court accepted the plea and sentenced Timms to 6 years, 1 year in home detention with his aunt, and 5 years on probation. Timms also paid a total of $1,203 for his actions. Several months after, a private law firm filed a civil case against Timms to forfeit his vehicle on behalf of the state. This fell against the 8th Amendment of excessive fines because his car was worth more than $42,058.30, which would be on his maximum statutory fine of $10,000 for his Class B felony.
We will be addressing our first point, why excessive fines should be incorporated through the privileges and immunities clause instead of the due process clause. The incorporation clause of the 14th Amendment appears in its first section, stating, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." A statement that the state of Indiana ignores by enforcing its civil forfeiture of Timms' Land Rover and taking away a portion of his 8th Amendment rights.
If anything should be incorporated by the states, priority should be given to the Bill of Rights, the original 10 amendments written by the framers of the Constitution and enforced from the very beginning. The Privileges and Immunities Clause prevents a state from treating citizens of other states in a discriminatory manner, and it grants every citizen the right of equal protection of the laws. In relation to this case, the law granted would be the right to not be excessively fined.
So why should this court incorporate under the Privileges and Immunities Clause rather than under the Due Process Clause?
Well, Your Honor, if we allow this court to be incorporated through the due process clause, it would mean that Timms did in fact receive due process. But in today's case, Timms was fined $30,000 more than the amount he should have been fined, so he did not receive due process, and therefore we should incorporate it through the Privileges and Immunities Clause. However, in the case before the court, Timms was forced to forfeit his vehicle. The Privileges and Immunities Clause allows Timms the right to equal protection, meaning he has the same rights as any other citizen. The government took his vehicle, and this is not the same rights as any other citizen. He was excessively fined, way more than $10,000, which does not fall under the clause. And if we allow the court to incorporate this under the due process clause, it would mean that he did in fact receive fair treatment under the law.
But in this case, he was charged 4 times the maximum amount of $10,000. On top of that, the burden Timms places on his neighbor by having to borrow their car and commute to work, and the difficulties of paying $40,000 for the value of his Land Rover creates a monetary punishment, one that is $30,000 over the maximum fine Timms should have to pay. The fact that this is not seen as an issue by the state of Indiana is a very serious problem that should be addressed in the Supreme Court, and the 8th Amendment excessive fines clause should apply in state level as it is in the federal level.
Yes, but in this case, since it's a civil forfeiture, is that really the same thing as a fine? Because a fine is meant to punish, and in this case, the civil forfeiture is meant to take away the instrumentality of crime.
Well, Your Honor, the 8th Amendment states that the citizen should not be excessively fined, and using a textual wording of the 8th Amendment, fine, meaning, as you said, the punishment, it's still that $40,000 that his Land Rover costed, which is $30,000 over the statutory fine.
In the case Chicago v. Chicago, the landowners were granted compensation for the land that was taken to build the railroad. The court held that the due process clause applied and required the states to award compensation when taking private property for public use. And since Timms was not given any compensation in today's case, we should incorporate the excessive fines clause under the Privileges and Immunities Clause.
Robinson v. California talks about the addiction to narcotics and the cruel and unusual punishment given for that. In this case, Timms' selling of drugs was punished with fines and the forfeiture of his car. The forfeiture of Mr. Timms' vehicle is a cruel and unusual punishment, since the forfeiture of his car falls under the excessive fines clause.
Since this case is a civil case, instead of focusing on the due process clause that is incorporated in a criminal case, we should look at this case with the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and therefore should only be incorporated through the Privileges and Immunities Clause.
We will now address our second point, why the confiscation of Mr. Tyson Tim's vehicle was an excessive fine under the 8th Amendment. The state taking his car away was an excessive fine according to the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment states that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. For the state to decide that Mr. Timms has to serve extra time and have his rover taken away, as well as having him pay $385, an interdiction fee of $200, court costs of $168, a bond fee of $50, and a $400 fee for undergoing a drug and alcohol assessment with the probation department.
The 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted Tim's Class B felony, had a maximum statutory fine of $10,000. At the time of the purchase, the vehicle was worth $42,058.30. The forfeiture of his vehicle was over 4 times the maximum fine of his crime, deeming the punishment unproportionate to the felony. As a former felon, being left without a means of transportation is cruel and unusual punishment and not proportionate to the nature of the offense, seeing as he has to go out to get a job and to attend court hearings.
So are you saying that the proportionality requirement that this court has said is required for the excessive fines analysis should also apply to a civil forfeiture?
Yes, Your Honor, because today the civil forfeiture of his vehicle was the fine that was imposed onto him, which was excessive. Like mentioned in Scout House incorporating the 8th Amendment, cases like Tim's are often ignored and poorly represented in the Supreme Court. If excessive bail cases are not represented, we have very little precedent set for future cases, weakening the effect they have on the protection of the rights of the people.
In 1993, a case very similar to the case before the court occurred involving forfeiture of property by the state. In Austin v. United States, Richard Austin was arrested for his possession and intent to sell cocaine in South Dakota.
The United States filed an in rem action and seized his property relating it to his drug activity. However, the forfeiture of his property created an 8th Amendment conflict by violating the excessive fines clause. The Supreme Court's holding was that the forfeiture was a monetary punishment, and because of this, is subject to the limitations of the excessive fines clause.
The in rem jurisdiction called by the United States in Austin v. United States placed this issue at the federal level. This issue in Timms v. Indiana is the incorporation of amendments at the state level, specifically the 8th Amendment excessive fines clause. The state of Indiana called a civil forfeiture against Tyson Timms, claiming his Land Rover and creating a disadvantage for him in having to borrow his neighbor's car to drive to work. Timms, in response, claimed a violation of his rights due to the state creating an excessive fine in the cost of having his vehicle returned.
Another example occurred in 2008, when Otis McDonald wished to purchase a handgun for his own protection in his neighborhood. The city of Chicago, however, refuses any applications for handguns after 1982 to help reduce their crime rate. This requirement was questioned when the courts realized that a Second Amendment issue was occurring, as the regulation to handguns hinders the right to bear arms to any residents who wish to purchase handguns after 1982.
Eventually, the case reached the Supreme Court, and it was ruled that the right to bear arms was protected by the Second Amendment, and the city of Chicago's decision to deny this right violates the incorporation clause of the 14th Amendment by undermining what the Constitution has decided as basic rights through its Bill of Rights.
McDonald v. Chicago is a clear example of the incorporation clause being ignored in jurisdictions lower than the federal level, in this case at the local level. The incorporation clause should extend to all jurisdictions, allowing the amendments to be the supreme superseding law of the land, especially the Bill of Rights.
In the case before the court, the 8th Amendment is being ignored by the state government, and the fines applied to Timms indirectly are clearly excessive, and in turn a violation of the excessive fines clause of its respective amendments.
In conclusion, following the precedents set by the Supreme Court in Austin v. United States and McDonald v. City of Chicago, this court should find that the 8th Amendment, specifically the excessive fines clause, should be incorporated against the states due to its importance in establishing federal groundwork in state laws.
Therefore, we pray this court rule in favor of Timms and reverse the ruling of the Supreme Court of Indiana, creating a standard for all states to follow in the future.